Before I start this video, let me just remind you that I have a new account for all of my anime content and I started up my own comedy channel. With that being said, let's get back to the video. Napoleon Bonaparte, known for his military genius, had the rest of Europe fear him and the revolutionary ideas he defended. The other European states formed coalitions to defeat him multiple times. After the fifth one, this is what Europe looked like. Then he lost it all. But what if he remained in control of most of it? That is the question of this alternate history timeline. Our change to history will be that Napoleon Bonaparte will be more geopolitically tactful. One of the first changes I think this would result in is selling Saint-Domingue in 1799, shortly after he became consul to the United States, and used the money from that to do what he made the Louisiana Purchase for, which would mean he wouldn't have wasted all of that time, all those soldiers and resources against toussaint louverture. The US would want to buy it since they could always do with another slave state, and the rich white Southerners would be absolutely outraged that a bunch of slaves had set themselves free. They probably would want nothing more than to re-enslave them. Now, they wouldn't want to make Saint-Domingue into a slave state if it meant giving a large number of free blacks the vote and the right to settle in the continental US. In the Southwest, there was a near-genocidal campaign to drive the Mexican population out. So the Southerners would need to do the same and drive a large number of free blacks over the border into Santo Domingo. Another thing that would change is Napoleon would reform his navy. It had some obvious flaws, like his admirals being selected on the basis of patriotism rather than experience, making his warships easy for the British to steal. This would most likely mean a slightly earlier death for Horatio Nelson. After this timeline's version of the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon would make the Louisiana Purchase, then use the money from that to reform the other aspects of its navy. He would do this in the Baltic Sea, as training his soldiers in new ships would be hard in the Mediterranean since Britain has Malta, Gibraltar and Sicily. And to prevent himself from wasting so much money on Spain so that he can do all of this, he wouldn't have promulgated the Bayonne Statute, instead having his brother marry a woman from the Spanish royal family and force his brother to take her advice when no one is looking. This actually wouldn't change much for Latin America, as the aristocrats in Hispanic America would see her as a puppet and traitor to her country. They would think, why follow a treacherous Spanish queen and her French husband over a Latin American king? For those of you wondering why such shockwaves didn't travel throughout Spain's colonies in the Americas after the Spanish royal family married into the Habsburg dynasty, the reason is that didn't involve an Austrian invasion before declaring some random princesses marrying them. The various Latin American wars for independence may start slightly later, but they would end just as early due to British support. So with France's bigger and better navy in the Baltic this time, Britain wouldn't fully be able to blockade Napoleon's allies. This alone would have kept Russia aligned to Napoleon for longer, and Russia would have continued to enforce the continental system, but not forever. It wasn't only the British blockade that caused them to break up with Napoleon, it was also the French blockade. So Napoleon would have to alter the continental system slightly, since he didn't abide by it, and if he didn't invade Russia, who was violating it, his other allies and puppet states would follow suit. So first, instead of no trade from Britain, he would place a restriction which he himself would abide by. In our timeline, he bought a lot of boats from Britain for his army. So let's say if he had bought 80 to 90% and divided the import between France and its various puppet states, he would have still won the war that he bought them for and reduced Britain's exports to the rest of Europe heavily, and it would have been manageable enough for Russia. But this alone wouldn't be enough to make Russia abide by the continental system and remain a Napoleonic ally. Having the Duchy of Warsaw right on their doorstep was a bit of an insult. Had Napoleon given some of it to Russia, that would finally be enough. However, this would cause another problem. The Duchy of Warsaw was loyal to Napoleon, so it would send shockwaves throughout his realm. To reduce these shockwaves, he would have given some of Prussia's territory to the duchy after defeating them in the War of the Fifth Coalition. If Napoleon never invaded Russia, that would have given them more time to fight the Ottoman Empire. Due to Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the Serbians were left to fight the Ottomans alone. So in this alternate timeline, we would see an earlier Greek War of Independence and Ottomans retreating from the Balkans earlier. Russia would also likely annex Armenian lands from the Ottomans and possibly even further. Two new Balkan states would emerge, Bulgaria in personal union with Serbia, and they would probably be modelled on France being very nationalistic and having economic booms. With the Ottomans being so tied down in the Balkans, Mehmed Ali would have taken over Egypt sooner. And without Napoleon's invasion of Russia, then the Russians wouldn't have pursued Napoleon all the way to France. What the Russian soldiers saw outside of Russia, which for many of them was the only country they had ever seen, shocked them. They saw countries where the citizens had far more freedom than they did. This new perspective led to revolutionary ideas gaining hold. The first such example was the Decembrist revolt of 1825. Many of the officers and soldiers involved had fought during the Napoleonic Wars and had come back wanting reforms. But this doesn't mean that Russia would be more authoritarian than it is in our timeline, since Tsar Alexander I initially idolized Napoleon and wanted to imitate him. But he had this weird 18th century absolute monarchy vision where the ruler imparted or gifted rights to the people, but retained ultimate power, and when popular demands went beyond what he was prepared to grant, like a written constitution or an elected parliament, he became increasingly repressive. How those contradictory impulses would have worked out in a timeline where relations never broke down with Napoleon is hard to tell. Considering Britain would be trying to blockade Russia since it's remaining loyal to the continental system, and also trying to blockade the United States at the same time, they would be on the same side in the War of 1812. But Britain also has an additional ally in this war in this timeline. Since they would have helped Mexico out a lot, it would be Mexico's turn to help Britain out in this war. Since Mexico has a much greater presence near to America than Russia has near to Canada, and Britain came very close to taking New Orleans from America, this war would be a decisive British victory, with New Orleans going to either Britain or Mexico, and Canada taking Alaska's panhandle. And this war would be a bit like the Crimean War for Russia, since it would be like a wake-up call, making them realize that they were militarily behind. I also think Britain would conquer the island of Hispaniola and then set it free from both the United States and Napoleon, and forge a strong alliance with the island, which would now be Haiti. And since it would be a strong British ally, it wouldn't have been forced to pay those crippling reparations. Since Britain couldn't trade with much of Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, it created a gap in the market that Ireland plugged, so Ireland was industrializing during this period of time. In this timeline, since that gap lasts longer, Ireland would continue to industrialize until it is fully industrialized much sooner than in our timeline. And kelp gathering in Scotland was profitable for the same reason. That would also continue. During the 18 teens in our timeline, France was too politically unstable and attacked by successive revolutions to industrialize, but in this timeline, it would firmly be under the rule of Napoleon, and there would be no War of the Sixth Coalition. So it would start to industrialize during this time. Due to the continental system lasting throughout the 1810s, Britain's trade deficit with China would likely be even worse. So I think we can expect to see the Opium Wars happen around 1820 in this timeline. In the early 19th century, European and Chinese fleets had been warring against the largest pirate fleet in history in the South China Sea. By the time the Opium Wars had happened in our timeline, these pirates had largely been defeated. These pirates didn't consider themselves beyond working as mercenaries, so even though Britain would still win the Opium Wars, it would be a much harder win. This means China has a much better chance to modernize sooner. summer, so we likely won't see an outright colonization of parts of China, but we will see a Russian sphere of influence in the north and a British one in southern China. But later Japan would invade China and the balance of power would swing in Britain's favour. It would be during this time, while Britain is busy with its massive naval war against China, that France and its puppets would finish off the Barbary Coast, since the British Navy would be unable to defend it. They would have already taken out Gibraltar and would probably go after Sicily and Malta. With the Portuguese royal family kicked out of Portugal and making what at this stage seems like their permanent home in Brazil, the coastal parts of Angola and Mozambique that they had colonized would become a part of the Brazilian Empire. Also, since the Brazilian Empire is ruled by the Portuguese royal family, who were close allies of Britain, and because of the sheer size of the Brazilian Empire and how small the other states are in South America, Brazil is gonna take over a lot more of South America. Not to mention how unstable the Hispanic countries in the Americas were, since Spain directly administered their colonies in the Americas directly and made them unable to act independently, which meant that when they did get independence, they failed to act independently of the Spanish crown. After Spain was conquered by Napoleon, the Spanish colonies collapsed into brutal civil wars about class and race. Another thing to note is that Napoleon is the founding father of nationalism in Europe. The people he ruled over saw the similarities they had with each other and the differences they had with their French rulers, and then they hated being drafted into wars for French interests, which would lead to revolts. After Napoleon dies in 1821, there will be a power vacuum. France, its allies from the Napoleonic Wars, Muhammad Ali, Napoleon's former puppet states, and the Habsburgs, since now they're related to the Bonapartes, would be at war with Prussia, the Ottomans, British, and Brazilian empires. Since Prussia was a military with a state, rather than a state with a military, and various nationalist rebellions, Prussia would be enlarged, but not to the extent they were after the German unification in our timeline. During the peace agreements, they'd be forced to make concessions so that Russia and Muhammad Ali don't completely divide the Ottoman Empire and Britain keeps its own life support. The Ottomans are still losing a lot of land, even though Prussia would be a powerhouse since it's fighting enemies on all sides. It won't be able to force the Netherlands or Belgium out of French hands, and Brazil won't be able to take back Portugal due to not being industrialized, as it was an agrarian slave economy, although the distraction of their soldiers being there would be a big help to Germany. After the war, we'd likely see Swabia and Bavaria independent from Prussia due to playing Protestants and Catholics against one another. They would probably form a Holy Roman Empire 2.0. Due to Britain focusing so much on Europe, Russia would likely take back some of the Alaskan panhandle in this war. Napoleon would likely be succeeded by his older brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as his son was still a little boy. Being family with Austrian empires he'd be dealing with, they'd both likely agree to create a unified Italy and have the Austrian Habsburgs marry the Italian Bonaparte, since Joseph was also king of Naples. During the Mexican-American War, Mexico would get British support and America would get Russian support, like in the War of 1812. But this time it will be different. The US has the Rust Belt now, so even though Canada has a larger population than it did in our timeline due to Britain making preparations for another war. Another thing making it more evenly matched is that the Irish industrial middle class didn't collapse after Napoleon, causing the Irish to over-rely on the potato. There will be no Irish potato famine, and the North recruited many Irish immigrants. So since it will be much more evenly matched, the US will conquer everything up to the deserts on the border with Mexico, like it did in my timeline about Mexico. This may seem like hardly an improvement for the Mexican side, but the US could have conquered far, far more of Mexico in our timeline if it wanted to, but was worried about upsetting the balance between free and slave states. Other butterflies of there being no Irish potato famine include no Halloween outside of Ireland and Boston having a completely different police force. When Muhammad Ali puts Egypt into debt during the American Civil War and Britain invades it like it did in our timeline, they won't be able to conquer all of it since it would have more and stronger allies, and since it began modernizing slightly earlier, but he won't be able to keep all of Egypt, so I'll go with the middle ground and say that the British would seize the Suez Canal but not the rest of Egypt, Moving on to the 1850s, when the Anglo-Persian War happened. The Russo-Bonaparte Habsburgs would support Persia, preventing Persia from losing Herat. However, they'd provide the bare minimum support for Persia to win. So after Persia is weakened from the war, Russia will probably conquer Herat or somewhere else in Persia. However, they also may decide to support Persia more than I previously said, to make it an ally. Moving on to the 1860s, when Wallachia and Moldavia unite into Romania and Romanian nationalism becomes popular, Russia and Austria-Hungary would be at odds, since there was a large place in the Austro-Hungarian Empire dominated by ethnic Romanians called Transylvania. Russia will also take the opportunity to liberate other majority Orthodox Christian areas of Austria-Hungary. France will take Russia's side, since the French royal family will be related to the Austro-Hungarian one. It will be an excuse to claim the Austrian and/or Hungarian crowns. This would lead to Greek annexation of the Ionian Islands and Serbian expansion into Dalmatia. Britain would probably support Prussia, who'd want to aid the German Habsburgs, or at least German Austria, with Russia, while Russia is dealing with the Hungarians. Italy would try to take ethnic Italian areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, along with the Croat and Slovene parts it wanted from them in World War I in our timeline. Prussia would probably take over Swabia and Bavaria while France is distracted. Now, I'm almost a century after Napoleon was deposed in our timeline, so things get quite tricky to predict from now on. But here's my guess. This timeline would have its own version of World War I, with China, Austria, Prussia, the Balkans, Egypt, the Scandinavian countries, and the US on one side, against Brazil, Mexico, Britain, Prussia, and Japan. The former alliance would likely win due to the same reasons why the Entente won in our timeline, and Italy would either join the losing side immediately because it wants some parts of Austria it didn't get earlier, or wait until it's clear one side is winning. It may even join the war on one side and switch sides repeatedly. So many of the territorial changes would be so dependent on which empire colonizes which parts of Africa, which I'm not even going to joke about trying to predict, as so much of that is butterflied. What I can say is likely is Britain is kicked out of Egypt, Japan is kicked out of China, Germany is likely punished similarly to how it was in our timeline, albeit not quite as severely from France, since this wouldn't have been as taxing of a war, and Russia gets more of Germany. And since by this time Britain is facing so many enemies with large, powerful navies, some part of Britain might be conquered. It would possibly lose all of its colonies. World War II is going to be even harder to predict, but perhaps this timeline's version of the League of Nations could prevent it. But anyway, here's what is certain. China would have been much more powerful due to being more stable and industrializing earlier, likely without the problems caused by the Great Leap Forward. As for Russia, considering what I said about Tsar Alexander I and Napoleon, I think Russia would be like China in terms of how authoritarian or free it is. You see, in Chinese civilization, you're expected to show a great deal of loyalty to your higher-ups in work and your rulers, and those in charge are expected to be very responsible with the loyalty they are given. If either the ruler or the ruled does something irresponsible, it brings shame to their group. So if the ruler brings shame upon his group, then the Chinese people as a group will stand up to their tyranny. Another thing is that when the Netherlands was under French occupation, Britain had seized all of its colonies and returned them later, but since the Netherlands remains under French occupation, Indonesia would remain a British colony, and so it would be more like Malaysia and would be a part of it, and Suriname and Guyana would be the same country. Thank you all so much for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell so that you can stay tuned for my next video, which will be a timeline about the Philippines, and it should be uploaded 2 weeks from now. So don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. Those both really help me with YouTube's algorithm.